Hi guys, it's Mrs. H here. We're going to go ahead and look at macromolecules. So let's go ahead and get started. So at the end of this unit, you're going to be able to describe the structures of carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins and nucleic acids. You're going to be able to distinguish the difference between them and understand processes in making these structures. So here's our key vocabulary for this unit. So if we look at the word macromolecule, macro means big, so we're looking at big molecules, and these macromolecules are actually made up of the following elements. So we've got carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. So all macromolecules, so all organisms, living organisms, have macromolecules that are made of these elements. So when we look at how this progresses, if we're starting with those atoms are going to bond together to form those macromolecules made of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, sulfur, and phosphorus. And they're going to make the big, large molecules. But then what happens to those big, large molecules? Well, those molecules will actually form the structures that make up our cells. And so then in turn, the cells make up tissues, and tissues will then make up organs, and organs will make up our organ system, and then we'll end up with our complex organism, all starting with those 6 atoms. So when we look at macromolecules, the big guy, the big important element in the macromolecule is carbon. Carbon will always, 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 always be found in a macromolecule. If you remember back in physical science when we learned about our atoms, we learned about carbon. We talked about how carbon has its own field of study called organic chemistry, because all living organisms are made of carbon, and this carbon molecule has these really cool things that it can do. And so it has its own field of study. And what you look at in that field of study is those carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. And all of those are made of carbon. So you know these, you're familiar with them. Your carbohydrates are the ones that always get the bad rap, which they shouldn't. These are your breads and your pastas, your grains. Then you have your lipids. We know these as fats, oils, and waxes. Your butters, your proteins. Proteins often are thought of as your meat that you eat, like your salmon or your steak or your chicken. And that's not entirely true, because plants do have protein, but we just don't think of them in those terms. And then your nucleic acids, the most common and most familiar would be your DNA. So let's look at the role of carbon in all of this. So going back to our physical science, remember we have carbon has 6 protons, neutrons, and electrons. And so why is that important? It's important because carbon then will form 4 covalent bonds to have a full outer energy level. And so that's really unique in its ability, that it needs 4. And the other thing, that it's covalent. So instead of becoming positive or negative because of the sharing of the giving up of electrons, carbon's not going to give up its electrons. It's not going to take electrons. It's actually going to share. So any bond it forms, it's sharing its electron. And so it forms really strong bonds between any atom that bonds with it. And so what kind of bonds can we have? What else is unique about these bonds? Well, the bonds can be either single bonds, double bonds, or triple bonds, which most other atoms can't do all 3. Some can do single bonds, some can do double bonds, but very few can actually do triple bonds. So what else is unique about carbon? Well, how they actually bond. So the orientation that these bonds can come in. You can have a straight line of carbon chain. They could actually branch and so get like this network, or they can actually form rings. Rings are what you see in specific types of molecules, and straight is another. So depending on the form it takes will depend on what kind of macromolecule it is. So let's go ahead and take a minute and review these 4 questions before we move on. Okay, so how did you do? Were you able to answer these correctly? If you did, good job. If not, you might want to go back and review. So now let's look at how these macromolecules are laid out. So a monomer and a polymer is just a really mono meaning one. So we have one subunit and poly meaning multiple subunits. And so macromolecules can come as single units or as multiple units. And I kind of like to think of this as a house. And so how do we build a house? So we need bricks. And so one individual brick would be the monomer. And if we put a whole bunch of bricks together, then we have a polymer. And so how do we make that polymer? Well, we have a reaction called a condensation reaction. So if I take one unit and I glue it together with another unit, so if I mortar the two bricks together, I would get two bricks, right? Well, we got a special name for that, polymer, right? And what happens when a polymer is made? What happens when we bond two of those monomers together? We get water. And so that's why it's called a condensation reaction. Condensate, like on the side of your glass, produces water, right? So we're going to produce water when we make a polymer. And so here's an example of a condensation reaction. So if I have one glucose sugar and another glucose sugar and I bind them together to make maltose, then I am going to get water as a result. So if I have those two together, we actually call that a two of those together. Now, if I reverse it and put it in the other order and I break it down, it's called hydrolysis. And we actually need water to do that. Our body does hydrolysis all the time. So hydrolysis is our body's really effective at, which we need water to do this. So when you're dehydrated, you're actually not able to break down your foods properly. So dehydration is lacking water because we can't do this hydrolysis reaction in our body. So I can't break down my proteins. I can't break down my carbohydrates without water. And so we eat all this food, but if we don't have enough water, we're actually not able to process our food very well. So let's go ahead and do a little comprehension tack between monomers and polymers. And so how did we do? And again, if we need to go back review, go ahead and do so now. So let's look at the specific types of macromolecules, those biochemical compounds. So that so carbohydrates, macromolecule. Carbs is what we usually refer them to. These are made of actually carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That's it. 3 atoms. That's it. 3. That's all of them. So all your different varieties of carbohydrates, all of those vastly different things only are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. 3 things. Crazy, right? And so carbohydrates we consider our primary fuel for a living body. So if you are into sports and they tell you, okay, you want to stock up on your carbs the night before, what they're telling you is you want your fuel source ready and available for your game. So you got to eat a good carbohydrate meal. So we have different kinds of carbohydrates. We've got mono, meaning one. Mono sugar is basically what a monosaccharide is saying, one sugar. That's your glucose, fructose, and galactose. Fructose gets a bad name. That's your high energy corn syrup. It's not so bad. It's just how much we eat it and the way we eat it. Fructose in and of itself is not bad. You've got disaccharides, that's your maltose, sucrose, and lactose. So those of you that are lactose intolerant, you can't eat cheese and dairy products, that's a disaccharide. And then your polysaccharides, these are your starches, your glycogen, and your cellulose. So those are your big carbohydrates. So poly, really, really big, mega molecules. So let's look at these. So most monosaccharides have anywhere between 3 and 7 carbons. So here's 2 different examples. Notice the carbohydrate forms a ring. The carbon is a ring, right? So do you see all of the carbons in there, and it's forming a ring, excuse me, a ring-shaped structure. That is very common. This is how we see carbohydrates in that pattern. So again, these can be monosaccharides, 3 or 7 carbons, but they're forming a ring. And so your disaccharides have 2 rings of those 3 to 7 carbons, but then they're actually bonded together. And so we have 2 rings of sugar attached to each other. So this is like your table sugar, that's your sucrose, and then your fructose, which is, or not, sorry, fructose, your lactose. So those are in your cheeses and your milks. These all have 2 sugars. So when we break these down in our body, we're just separating those 2, breaking just one bond and breaking the 2 monosaccharides into individual parts. And then we have polysaccharides. So these are the kind of sugars that we want to eat the day before our big athletic event, because we have lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of these little monosaccharides all attached. And so when we break those down into those individual monosaccharides, we're going to be able to get lots of energy, right? And instead of having a big old bash of it in a sucrose, so boom, all of a sudden we have all kinds of sugar when we eat our fructose. If we have this polysaccharide, we're going to be able to spread the sugar out over a long period of time, and so it's more sustainable. So this would be your breads, your pastas, your potatoes, those kind of things are we're most familiar with. So polysaccharide. Polysaccharides are really good for energy storage in plants. So we usually see these in our cell walls of our plants. And so that's our starch. Glycogen is actually energy storage, but this is in animals and it's in our liver and in our muscle cells. So where starch is in plants, glycogen is in the animal. But again, both a polysaccharide. Oh, I already talked about this one, the glucose. So again, our plant and building our plant structure up. So again, our polysaccharide, glucose in our cell wall of our plant. So now our next polysaccharide, or not polysaccharide, our next monosaccharide, I can't speak, our next macromolecule, I am sorry, our next macromolecule is lipid. Lipids are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So again, only 3 atoms. These are our fats, our insulin, our hormones. So like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone. Those are all lipids, which we often forget about because we think of lipids as fats, but they're really important and they're more than just fats. So let's go ahead and take a look at these. So our common ones we know of, like I just said, this would be like your corn syrup or your corn oil or canola oil or your vegetable oil, your butter. A good way to know whether or not it is a lipid is whether or not when you put it in water, whether or not it will mix with water, because lipids don't mix with water. And so what are lipids made up of? They all have a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. So we have 3 chains kind of attached to a glycerol as the backbone. And notice there's all kinds of carbon and hydrogens, and then a few oxygen. And so when we hear of the word saturated or unsaturated or polyunsaturated, what we're referring to is whether or not the carbons in that chain have bonds in it. And so if it is no bonds, they're all single bonds, there's no double bonds, they're all single bonds, it's saturated, it's full of hydrogen. And so if there's some missing hydrogen because the carbon formed a double bond, we call it unsaturated. And if there are many double bonds in it, we call it polyunsaturated. And so let's go ahead and do a check on our carbohydrates and lipids. Okay, so how'd you do? So now let's look at our proteins. So our proteins, again, are made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but now this time we have nitrogen and sulfur. And so these are, again, what we think of as a structural component. For a long time, scientists thought proteins were actually the genetic code because they're so complex and they're so diverse. But we found out later that it actually is not. It's our fourth macromolecule. So proteins come in thousands of different unique functions and shapes, everywhere from transporting molecules across the cell membrane to transporting molecules within the body to hormones, so regulating body functions, to antibodies, to actually your muscle and structure. So it has lots and lots of jobs and lots of functions. All of them are made up of um, 20 amino acids. So the amino acid here would be the monomer. So there's 20 monomers, 20 amino acids that can combine in lots of different combinations and lots of different sizes to make this complex, unique protein. And so each amino acid then has specific structures on there. They have what's called hydrogen atom, carboxyl group, amino group, and then amine group, and then a variable group. The variable group is what makes each one of them unique. The other three they all have in common. So there's a little tag on the end of each amino acid that makes them look different. They're made up of different combinations of atoms. And so that's what's different between one amino acid and another amino acid. Now we'll go over those a little more when we get into a couple other units, but for now, that's all you really need to know. And so what happens to these amino acids? Well, they're going to bind together, right? And when they bind together, they form what's called a peptide bond. And so again, what happens, this is a condensation reaction because we're losing an H and an OH from each one, and we're creating water. So it's again a condensation reaction. And so we're going to have a whole bunch of these peptide bonds on a protein. So sometimes proteins are called polypeptides. And then what happens to this long chain of amino acids that's called a primary structure? They're actually going to either form what's called a sheet, a helix sheet, an alpha sheet, or a beta sheet. And basically one's just a straight line and one kind of have curves. And then what will happen is a tertiary structure is it'll start to fold and bend. And these folds and bends will create a really complex interlapping structure. And I kind of like to think of this as a string. So think of a long string and I keep twisting and twisting and twisting. And I can just roll that string into lots of different shapes and structures. That's basically what we're doing with a protein. And so let's look at two common ways we use proteins in our body. One is an enzyme and one is a hormone. So an enzyme is basically speeding up a reaction. So anything going on in your body that you need to get going and you need to make it happen quicker, you need an enzyme for. So it'd be like I'm making Kool-Aid and I want to make the Kool-Aid, make it faster. So I'm going to use warm water, enzyme, and I'm going to stir it, enzyme. Okay, so enzymes speed up reactions. The other one is a hormone, and hormones are basically messengers that help control specific processes. So insulin is an example. So what does insulin do? Insulin helps regulate and control glucose in your body. So the hormone insulin controls glucose. So hormones control things in your body, just like testosterone or estrogen. Both of those are controlling things in either the female body or the male body. So our last macromolecule is a nucleotide. So we're going to spend a long time on these probably in the next week or so. And this is the nucleic acid. Nucleic acids have a monomer called a nucleotide. And these nucleotides are made up of, again, listen, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, those same three we've seen before, but this time nitrogen and phosphorus. So it actually has 5 atoms of those 6 present. And so the nucleotide has three parts to it. It has a phosphate, a sugar, and a nitrogen base, which we will look in detail in the coming weeks when we get into nucleic acids. And all nucleic acids are made of nucleotides. Here, the beginning suffix. So when we look at nucleic acids, we're really looking at deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid, our genetic material. There is a third called ATP, which we will talk about when we get into photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So deoxyribonucleic acid, this is what we know as the genetic code. This is the instructions for making everyone who they are. And so this is the instruction book for making you and making the amoeba an amoeba. Where the ribonucleic acid, this actually helps the DNA do what it needs to do. So it's the helper. They're the team players. And there's three kinds: messenger RNA, ribosomal RNA, and transfer RNA. Again, they're helping the DNA out. And so again, when we get into nucleic acid unit, we'll look at these more completely. So let's go ahead and do our final comprehensive check. And so how did we do? So I hope this helps. Remember, you can always go back and re-listen to this, and I will see you guys later. Bye.